What we saw last week or last Friday in the South was a huge historic victory for LGBTQ rights and for equality. And it really is amazing that, for example, it is the first country in the world, I believe, to pass marriage equality via national popular vote. And it is when you consider the history of the state of the South, it's a huge victory. What you had in Dublin and in Cork and the other major cities on last Saturday after the result was announced was just an incredible atmosphere, a huge celebration, huge numbers of people filling up the streets. It was like a festival was on or something, and just an amazing atmosphere. And even there's already a notable change to me anyway, in the sense that you see more. I've seen more just in the last week, openly, LGBT couples and things like that on the streets where you can identify them than I've seen probably in the last 5 years or something. It's been a complete change in atmosphere, and it's an incredible victory. And just to put it in some context, obviously, this is happening in a state where until 1993, homosexuality was illegal and criminalised, and where obviously you had laws against contraception, divorce, etc. until very recently. And it isn't just the fact that there was a victory, which always seemed more likely than not, but that there was such a scale of a victory with 62% yes vote versus 38% no vote, with a 60% turnout, which is very high for a referendum. Only one constituency in the country voting no. So it was the spread of it and the scale of it, I think, was hugely important, because it's a huge blow to the religious right, etc. So, and if you just compare it to some of the previous referendums, like in 1995, you had the divorce referendum to legalise divorce, and that was passed by 50.2% to 49.8%. So it was passed on an absolute knife edge. But this was a really, really strong victory. So I think the question is, how was that achieved? And I think the short answer to that question is that there was a movement built, a real movement involving people from the ground up, from the bottom up, which achieved that and brought that about. So I think that obviously started before the referendum, and the fact that the referendum took place at all was the outcome of years and years of campaigning by LGBT activists. And you would have had large protests, you would have had obviously the Pride Parade, but also large protests every year for many years in Dublin and other places, demanding marriage equality. And this referendum was in that sense the outcome of a struggle and a campaign by people. But critically, the campaign itself was a movement. I think that's fair to say. Just to give some examples of that, there was 66,000 people registered to vote on what's called the supplementary register before the vote. So there were 66,000 people who hadn't been voting before, registered to vote in order to vote for this, and actually more, because there were people actually registering, up to probably a year before the vote actually took place. So we don't know the figures. And just give an example, in one part of Dublin, which is called Fingal, there was, of the people who went onto the supplementary register, an incredible 96% of them turned out to vote. So people mobilised in really big numbers to vote for this. You had, and it was all over social media, people coming home who had emigrated or were out of the country, young people coming home in order to vote, in the days before the referendum. We don't know how many of them were, but there were definitely lots of them. There were, leading up to it, yes badges being worn absolutely everywhere, particularly in Dublin, particularly in Cork and in big cities. People just, actually you wouldn't walk down the street without seeing a bunch of people wearing a yes to equality badge. And I think that's really, really important. Just to give a small example of Cork, where I'm living, there was, in one area which is called Mahon, which is a kind of a quite deprived working class area, you had like a group of kind of teenage girls who were going around graffitiing all the walls with yes, vote yes to equality kind of stuff everywhere, So there was just so many people getting involved and getting active in their own way around this, you know. And then we don't know how many, but thousands of people got involved in canvassing and campaigning, etc. You know, in a more structured way during the campaign. So this was a social movement, and what that social movement was about, I think, and how it developed wasn't about the issue of marriage. It was about the issue of equality. It was about a vote of acceptance and support to LGBTQ people, and it was about you know, saying that we need a different and more equal and progressive society. So I think that, you know, and if you look at where the yes vote was strongest, obviously young people who mobilised on this and voted on this in huge numbers. I think it was particularly strong among women, and in many cases women were in their own communities very important advocates for a yes vote. And also, I think very importantly, there was a very strong yes vote in working class areas. Yeah, for example, just to give some examples, people may not know the areas, but generally speaking, in working class areas, particularly of Dublin, but also of other places, you had big increases in turnout from what you normally get, and you had huge yes votes. So just people may not know the areas, but these are quite what would be considered deprived or neglected working class areas. You know, you had in a place called Cherry Orchard 90%, Jobestown 87%, the Liberties 88%. So just yes votes on an absolutely massive scale, which outstripped anything that took place anywhere else in the country. And I think that's really interesting, because obviously this is often portrayed and was portrayed by the no side as being like the project of a kind of a liberal elite in society, or however they would put it. And also there were many you know, who would have supported a yes vote, maybe who would have been concerned that there was a more conservative attitude in those areas, but it turned out to be exactly the opposite. It was the government minister, a guy called Eoin O'Riordan, he commented in the lead up to it that you know, people who were campaigning or active on the water charges movement, which is taking place in the south, would vote no in order to punish the government. But actually what we saw is in the areas where that movement was strongest, you had people who had become politicised by it turning out to vote yes, and vote yes for equality. And I think that, you know, what you saw there was a huge display of kind of community solidarity, because now in every community, including working class communities, you have you know, LGBT people who live there, who have been known, etc. And I think that was a very, very important part of it. I think that the no campaign basically had two flanks. One was that everyone deserves a mother and a father, etc. You know, that kind of line of argument. And I think that fell flat. I think it fell flat because it doesn't actually reflect the reality of the different kind of families that exist and the different, you know, the reality of people's lives at the moment. And I think that then their second argument was that they were being silenced and bullied and all the rest of it, etc. But I mean, what came out in the campaign and what the kind of stories that came out was that actually people who've been silenced for so long are actually LGBT people. And I think that came out, and also that, you know, in reality, you know, that they've engaged in a campaign to try and shut down this debate. For example, they sued last year the national broadcaster because Panty, who people may know, described various people from the No campaign correctly as homophobes, and you know, they got 80 grand. So I mean, it was actually the opposite that was taking place. But so I think that this is just a hugely significant and important movement, and what's happening is not, you know, let's all give ourselves a pat on the back and this is over now. What's happening is this is a platform to move on and fight for full equality in so many ways. You are seeing attempts now to portray the South as this bastion of this leader of progress and equality, etc. in the world. I don't think so. But I think that what is true is that the attitudes of people have shifted hugely over decades. The authority of the church, the Catholic Church, has obviously been weakened dramatically, and opinion has just changed massively, and that was reflected in the vote. But there's obviously huge areas of law where, you know, there's still inequality, as well as in the whole structure of the state and society itself. The just to give, and actually the establishment, political establishment, is behind where people are, and the support that actually exists for equality and for change. Just to give some examples of what still exists. I mean, obviously you have, as I think you do here as well, a blood ban against gay and bisexual men donating blood. You have a crazy situation now where, because the Catholic Church runs almost all the schools, most of the hospitals, etc., has huge power in terms of delivering public services, there's actually a religious exemption to so-called equality, there's a so-called religious exemption to equality legislation. So if you are a teacher working in a church-run school, which is almost all of the schools, you can get married, but you can be fired the next day for getting married to someone of the same sex, because that is the law as it stands. So a major campaign now, I think, will be, and a major issue will be the issue of education, the need to remove that religious exemption. Anti-Austerity Alliance is putting a bill about in the Dáil in a few weeks' time, and there needs to be major pressure on that issue. You have obviously major issues still around transgender people and issues of gender recognition. And crucially, you still have just embedded in the state the power of the Catholic Church, which, as I said, controls schools, hospitals, various public services, is the biggest private landowner in the state, etc. And for example, if you take an issue like the need now for education in schools to reflect the new reality, the fact that we have legal equality, and to reflect the fact that there's different types of families, and also to crucially to validate and educate young people who are LGBT on their own identity and sexuality, well, that's going to be a major block to that church control of schools. So that campaign and the issue of separation of church and state, I think, now comes on the agenda. And then there's the issue of abortion, obviously, where you have the Eighth Amendment in place, which places a pretty much absolute ban on abortion, with the only exception being where a woman's life is in danger, although that's very difficult often to establish until it's too late. And so we've had cases, people probably know, of women dying severe Halappanavar because of lack of access to an abortion. So I think that that issue has now kind of come onto the agenda as a result of not just this vote, but how strong the vote was. You now have the issue of we need to repeal the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution and allow for the introduction of abortion rights in Ireland, and that can be a huge campaigning issue for us. You do have, again, a block coming from the top of society. The fact that all the major political parties with varying levels of enthusiasm called for a yes vote, in the referendum, can make people think, well, there's a consensus now, there's agreement, and we're moving sort of forward naturally. But well, first of all, I mean, if you only need to, first of all, as I said, there were lots of individual members of those parties who quietly didn't campaign or even called for a no vote. I'm talking about TDs and leading figures, or talked out of both sides of their mouth on it. But also, if you look at the issue of abortion, where you've had a situation where there's been multiple bills brought to the Dáil in the last couple of years on the issue of abortion rights, and voted down by the government, by Fine Gael and Labour, by Fianna Fáil, by Sinn Féin, by all the major parties in there. So I think that the need, the lesson of this for me is that the way you get change, you have a grassroots movement, you get people active, you get people campaigning. You in that sense, you don't recede from taking up issues that are seen as difficult, but you just take them up and argue the point through. Because I think, for example, there was some reluctance to take up the issue during the campaign of LGBT people raising children, and the argument was kind of, well, it's not actually to do with that, it's only about marriage, which is true, but also it was, the question was left unanswered, if you know what I mean, in that sense, or could have been left unanswered in some cases. But I think it was actually crucial to take it up to argue the point that actually there's no problem with that it's not a bad thing, and that actually inequality is wrong. And if you win that argument, you can win a very, very strong victory. So that's basically where I'll leave the point I'd make. So I think that's the kind of campaign that's needed. It's a campaign that doesn't rely on the political establishment or the elites in society. I think that's what in a sense we had, because actually there was huge activity by people coming from the ground, and it's one that challenges all inequality, all oppression, and what we've seen with the kind of people, the working class people, women, young people, etc., coming out, voting yes in such huge numbers, is that you can build a movement which actually challenges, which links up people who are oppressed in different ways, marginalised in different ways, challenges oppression, and is capable of being a major movement and platform to challenge all inequality. So I'll just leave it there.